Relations between Russia and Ukraine are now apparently at the peak of escalation, and there has never been such a level of tension between the countries. Western countries predicted a big war, and ordinary Ukrainians are quite serious about Russia. Just 10 years ago, there were no such sentiments, and the countries were close partners. In this video, we will talk about how Ukraine and Russia have turned from close partners into the main enemies in the region. One way or another, historically, most of the lands of Ukraine were almost always part of Russia for many centuries. First in Imperial Russia and then in the Soviet Union, where management was also centralized. Modern relations between Russia and Ukraine begins in 1991 after the fall of the Soviet Union and the acquisition of independence by these countries. In general, relations between countries after the collapse of the Union were partnering. Countries maintained economic ties that appeared in the Soviet Union and signed many partnership agreements. However, even in the 90s, relations were not so smooth, and all because of the Crimea and the fleet, which is still relevant. Regarding Crimea, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, Crimea remained with Ukraine, acquired the status of broad autonomy. However, such broad rights only gave rise to additional separatist sentiments in Crimea, which even resulted in the victory of pro-Russian forces in Crimea in 1994, led by Yuri Meshkov and the Russian bloc. Back then, they were planning to secede from Ukraine and join Russia, or at least integrate into the Russian world. However, the Ukrainian authorities in 1995 abruptly stopped such intentions and reduced part of the Crimean autonomy, which made it possible to forget about separatism for almost 2 decades. It's interesting that Russia itself interfered little in such cases and did not particularly support this narrative. But what really the Russian authorities was worried about at that time was the Black Sea Fleet in the Crimea. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, the division of the fleet began between Ukraine and Russia, which caused huge disagreements up to the physical resistance of the sailors. But an even more important issue was the possibility of the presence of the Russian fleet and army in Crimea. Initially, the Ukrainian side did not allow such a scenario. But by suppressing Moscow, an agreement on friendship and cooperation was signed, which allowed the presence of the Russian fleet in Crimea and even presence of the Russian military. The treaty was extended during Yanukovych's rule, but expired in 2014. In general, major disagreements between the countries have been settled on this, and during the rule of Leonid Kuchma from 1994 to 2005, he quite successfully maneuvered between Russia and the West, trying to build a multi-vector policy. And honestly speaking, even under Kuchma, there was a small crisis around the island of Tuzla, but the conflict was solved quickly. The next stage in the deterioration of relations was the Orange Revolution and the coming of a pro-European leader to power. The Moscow authorities have always defended the position that the so-called color revolutions are a mechanism for the Western countries to overthrow objectionable regimes, and that such protests are being prepared in all post-Soviet countries, and not only. By that time, 3 such revolutions had already taken place in countries friendly to Russia. In 2000, the Bulldozer Revolution in Serbia, in 2003, the Rose Revolution in Georgia, and in 2004, in Ukraine. Yushchenko's rise to power heralded a new era in Russian-Ukrainian relations, and Russia realized for the first time that Ukraine's move to the West was a realistic scenario. In many respects, the integration of Ukraine to the West at that time was just hindered by Western countries. The key event was the Bucharest summit, as a result of which promises were made to Ukraine and Georgia that in future the countries would sign an action plan for NATO membership, which would give them the opportunity to join the alliance. Then Germany and France opposed the entry of these countries into NATO. This event irritated the Kremlin at that time, and today this summit is one of the key points of contention between the West and Russia. Moscow demands to annul such promises and guarantee that Ukraine will not join NATO. The next stage can be described as an era of warming relations. We are talking about Yanukovych coming to power and the return of the pro-Russian agenda to Ukraine. The Yanukovych government returned a certain closeness in relations between the countries. New trade agreements were signed, and the gas wars that were under Yushchenko became a thing of the past. Honestly speaking, the Yanukovych regime at the same time also tried to balance between Russia and the West, which led to widespread crisis in Ukraine in 2013, when Yanukovych refused to sign an association with European Union's countries, which the Ukrainian government had been preparing for the last couple of years. Such actions of the government were associated with the pressure from Russia and an attempt to lure Ukraine into the customs union. These events led to massive protests across the country that would later become known as Euromaidan. Russia again speaks out about the mass protests later calling them a color revolution. The political crisis led to the flight of Yanukovych and his close соратniks, and the interim president Turchinov became the head of the country. The beginning of the 2014 was a turning point in Russian-Ukrainian relations against the backdrop of a political crisis. Russia annexes Crimea with the help of the military and also shakes the situation in the southeast of Ukraine, which will result in a hybrid war in the Donbass. The main motive for interference in the internal affairs of Ukraine was the protection of the Russian-speaking population. These two events will turn Ukraine irrevocably away from Russia, and public opinion will become predominantly pro-Western in a way that has never happened before. Poroshenko's coming to power will only finally consolidate the hostile relations between Russia and Ukraine in international relations. During his reign, Ukraine began a clear shift to the West, and the two key agreements were signed, which play an important role today. We are talking about the Minsk agreements. The first were signed in September 2014 and the second in February 2015. In addition to the ceasefire, the agreement provides for the integration of the DPR back into Ukraine on special terms. This will keep Ukraine from integrating into Western institutions, and Donbass with a special status will be widely integrated with Russia and will not allow such a policy to be pursued. It's worth noting that such clearly unfavorable conditions for Ukraine were signed during critical moments for the Ukrainian army, when it suffered defeat after defeat. Zelensky's coming to power became the Kremlin's hope for the normalization of relations. Moscow hoped that Poroshenko, who relied on a patriotic audience, would be replaced by a more accommodating Zelensky. However, Zelensky continued Poroshenko's pro-European course and even became more intractable for Moscow. Until recently, negotiations on the Minsk agreements were last held only in 2019. The Kremlin became dissatisfied with President Zelensky as well as his attack on pro-Kremlin candidates from the parties of the opposition Platform for Life. Relations began to escalate again in 2021. Back in the spring, for the first time, Russia was pulling a contingent of troops of more than 100,000 people to the Ukrainian borders, and the last crisis that continues and today began in November 2021, when Russia pulled troops to the border of Ukraine and then sent Western countries their demands for security guarantees in Europe. These demands, which is in the West, have already been called an ultimatum, include clauses on guaranteeing the non-entry of Ukraine and Georgia into NATO, and also called for the withdrawal of weapons from NATO countries that were not members of the bloc until 1997. This crisis just brought out all the previously unresolved issues that have irritated the Kremlin for a long time. This is the expansion of NATO to the east. This is the promise to Ukraine and Georgia in the alliance. Summing up, it's worth saying that for 30 years, relations between Ukraine and Russia have been in varying degrees of tension. If earlier all this was solved with the help of agreements, then after 20 years, the language of diplomacy stopped solving problems and real military conflicts began. Today's escalation is the culmination of all this. If you find this video interesting and informative, don't forget to smash the like button and subscribe to this channel with the bell on, and see you guys in the next video. Peace!